So I'm going to talk about how writing systems can, in some circumstances, serve as a means to not only be reused between languages, but actually be a means to map cultural values, to create semantic alignment in the script transfer, and more specifically in the scenario where a language that didn't have a writing system imports one for its own use. And even more specifically now here, I'm going to talk about the script transfer from China to Japan. So this is the very specific setting in which we move. And it all started, for me personally at least, literally with a walk, not in the park, but in the woods, reflecting that some words, and actually the one that I had in mind was hakaru, which means essentially to measure, is written with different kanji combinations, but obviously has very similar semantics across these. Similar, not identical. At the same time, and so if I'm getting here to maybe a bit trivialities for many of you, but the rest will be pretty meaningless without that point. When the Japanese imported the Chinese script, they basically assigned typically two, sometimes more, but let's say typically two readings to it. One that was their interpretation of the Chinese original, the onyomi, and then one that basically is the translation into its own, into the native Japanese. And in this particular case, it so seems that there were differences in meaning in the Chinese original, but they all got mapped on the same word. Now, this may be a coincidence. Of course, I might just have reflected while walking in the woods on one specific case where this happens. So what I wanted to understand is this actually something that is more generic? And also, why are there some things where it obviously fits quite well and some others like planning, which seems to be a bit off? But we will see more of this later. Now, Japanese has many homophones that are written differently. Sometimes they are obviously generally different words. Sometimes, and this is the hypothesis here, which I'm going to test using a mixture of semantic similarity and graph technologies. These are actually an artifact of script transfer. Seeing that a culture that was perceived as being higher standing at that point in time, 1,500 years, give or take, had meanings, had differentiations that didn't exist potentially at that time. This goes a bit beyond the typical studies around phonographic adaptation in how to make use of a writing system to write your own language. Of course, that still enters. It's not to say that this is of no relevance, absolutely not. But it looks at the second element to this. And in a way, if we look at the typical Saussurean mapping, it's really about sound and meaning. And so it's the meaning part that is here in the focus. So the question of how does the concept translate across language if you have this Saussurean model in mind. This is not something new. In his work already, Handel pointed this out as part of the script transfer process, that characters were selected to write native lexical items on the basis of perceived similarity of meaning. And he also did this specifically for the case of Chinese to Japanese language. So this is really the aspect I'm looking at here, the mapping of meaning, not sound. To go back to my initial example of the measurement of the hakaru, actually it is like this, that if you go back, and here I have to trust also the dictionaries, because I don't actually master Chinese, so this is certainly something to keep in mind, that they do translate into different Chinese words, actually also at the time of borrowing. I mean, it doesn't make a lot of sense to speak of the meanings quite today, but that they were mapped on what is a single word, or used to be a single word in Japanese at the time. Again, this does not translate to everything. Another example is to write, kaku, where we have obviously related semantic concepts like to write, to draw, but also quite different ones, to be different, to be lacking, that are kept apart as well while writing, but that are not particularly semantically related, or not at all semantically related. Now again, I've picked here only some manually chosen examples. There are more, but still it doesn't translate into a generic concept. So what I did is to develop a little tool which got the code name Hanging Bridge. Has a symbol to connect different cultural spheres, and which uses on the one side functional languages, more specifically Haskell, together with the graph database Neo4j, and for some very limited activities, a Python tool to embed basically a bird model for those interested in this. So very simple, by now at least, a very simple model allowing to measure semantic similarity. All of these would not be possible without actually having basically all the relevant dictionaries available in machine readable format, because otherwise there would be nothing to build on. And actually used quite a few, starting from relatively obvious ones, like Kanji-dig, JM-dig, to the Unicode basis, to very specific period dictionaries, where I was very pleased to see that they are also available. I must also say that without actually having code development tools to support this would not have been possible to do in a meaningful time, or at least not in the time constraints that I had. Now, what is the core idea behind all of this? And then I will go into a bit more detail. If it is true that homophones were basically created into as separate words via applying distinctions in this source culture or transferring distinctions of the source culture into Japanese, then it should be more likely that these kanji actually belong to a cluster of semantically similar concepts rather than arbitrarily chosen one. If these were pure coincidence, or if they had been different from the start and they're really pure, genuine homophones, then we should see a random distribution of kanji compared to the overall set. This is basically what this little tool tests. It takes these dictionaries, it uses them to element a labeled property graph, and I will have a quick look at that in a second. It then looks at homophones and compares the similarity of those with random controlled similarity. So this is how they essentially look up, using again the same example. We have a reading linked to different writing forms and their base kanji, and then the original Sinitic reading behind, and the concept that these encoded, this concept, and that is an artifact of using the BERT model in its English version, actually was then compared using English, the English dictionary. So this is one reason that this comparison and these concepts are all expressed in English, so more technical reason than anything else. Time-wise. So if we look at this, we find some 38,000 ones that are homophones in the way I've just described them. Some of these are uninteresting because they are just artifacts of the way the dictionary is built. But then we have actually examples, notably in verbs, which go a bit more detailed. And this is what I said as the beginning hypothesis. The source senses should be more similar on average than random kanjis would be. And we can measure this across everything. Continue. Yeah, I don't think we have to go quite into the details of how semantic similarity is measured here by a classic cousin similarity, so nothing very spectacular in this ground. And as I already said, the comparison happens actually via the English concepts, and taking out all the artifacts, we whittle it down to about 15,000 control pairs that are then used. And if we then actually compare the similarity of words associated or kanji associated to the same reading, then we see that the probability indeed is significantly higher than the average. So if we have a comparison of 0.110 or so, 0.1, we have 0.3 as the actual comparison. So we can actually conclude out of all of this that the kanji are chosen by perceived similarity of meaning in most, though of course not in all of the cases. And we have seen at the very beginning a counterexample where they are genuine homophones that go too far. Actually, this gets better if we don't use current meaning for this, which is one of the constraints that I initially had before building on Middle Chinese dictionaries. If we actually take that step, then some cases that look abnormal, like to plan versus to measure, disappear, because current dictionaries describe this particular reading of hakaru as to plan, but originally it did have a meaning of to consider, or at least also had a meaning of to consider at the time of taking over. And that one is, even if we don't look at the mathematical values, already intuitively closer to the meaning of the rest of its comparison. That is, again, just one example taken for the whole set. So now, to give a bit more background still, we have, well, ultimately I used a mixture of sources to be the basis of the dictionaries. Some, like Unihana, are covering basically everything. Some of Middle Chinese are actually partial, but very valuable, as we have just seen in the case. And then we have a dictionary as one of the classical sources. Again, none of this would have been possible without building on existing data. So we are getting to the conclusion of all of this, but ultimately it is already there. What this tool and the analysis shows is that for many cases, actually it is so that the kanji encode semantic distinctions within a very related sphere of similarity. This is example of hakaru. Then there are cases where indeed these were probably forever different words. So there it doesn't apply. And then there are artificial cases that are homophones today, were actually not homophones at the time of takeover. So this we can also ignore. In other words, the core hypothesis for me is point one. It's not an absolute hypothesis, and it cannot be. But what it shows is that in many cases, kanji during the script import were used to introduce distinctions that existed in the source, but did not exist in the target language, but were made to create in the target language. Again, much of this needs to be seen in case that we have to evaluate ultimately more in detail how homophony even worked at the time of script transfer, because also Japanese obviously has undertaken some vowel changes, some sound changes, though not in the examples I've picked. Let's jump also over this and come, seeing the time. Yeah, 10 minutes is over. To the conclusion. In this case, we can measure how the hypothesis that Handel had already in his text, the hypothesis that seemed to strike in very individual cases, actually transfers on a more global scale, that in importing a writing system, the cultural values in the source culture were transferred together with the writing systems to create distinctions that didn't exist originally. And that in this sense, it's a map of the source culture's meaning space that was laid over on the target language. Now, of course, I'm pretty sure that much of these would apply in different settings to other cultures as well, including for much of the Western culture, the distinctions that were present in Greek and Latin cultures that were transferred to the target cultures. But in that case, it was not mediated via the writing system per se, because obviously the writing system being phonetic in that case, more or less, being a closed writing system, does not lend itself to that. It took other means, but it still happened. And with this also, I'm done. I have other examples, but I think for now, let's leave it at that.
And your first
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we can have time for 2 questions. So please mark to select anyone you want to answer.
Somebody would have to have a question first.
Yeah. You have any questions? Yeah.
Okay, I have a lot of questions. I think I will have to talk to you afterwards. But the thing that probably interests me most is at the beginning you said you have one word, one spoken word, Hakadu, and many written forms. And then afterwards you were pretty consistently talking about homophones, which to me implies that those are distinct words.
Yes.
So, do you think that when talking about spoken, like the spoken Japanese language, that those words distinguished by different kanji spellings are distinct words?
This is a very good question. It's ultimately the core question. But I will turn it around. What is a homophone? It is something we perceive as, even though it has the same sound, as having different meanings. And if I were to summarize the core hypothesis, is that these are manufactured homophones. If I express myself well, these were homophones that originally were not homophones, but actually became, as part of the cultural mapping, homophones, or perceived as homophones. Because what makes a homophone is the fact that we perceive them as having different meanings. And there are many cases, and for anybody who has played the game, how is it actually called in English, the game where you have where you play actually with different meanings of homophones. There are many cases where we can even debate if it's a single word or multiple words. So again, the core thesis is, yes, these are homophones today, but they are homophones created as part of the process of learning to write or importing writing systems. In this sense, I hope also it becomes clear that this is hopefully only seemingly a contradiction in the way I expressed myself. But absolutely, we can, of course, discuss.
Yeah, last question.
Yeah, it seems a bit like looking at the scripts as like looking at animals at the zoo in a way, because you have, I think like when these things happen between scripts, there's also a level of change and transformation into translation that is not exact translation, and it's something that happens, I think, with any kind of idea of translation. So I think all of the fact that it's also written is not just like something that we see typography-wise. All these factors, maybe even like in transcribing and in the gesture of writing being both Chinese and Japanese, very calligraphic, let's say, as scripts. Maybe there's something as well to consider there, but seeing them more as a live language rather than something that we just look at from a lens.
Yeah, yes, it is certainly a process of translation, translation even completely separate from any of the discussions here, always means you have to create distinctions in the target text that may actually not be obvious to express in that, because it refers to cultural concepts that may not exist in that form in the target culture, or in the worst case, actually it may exist, but in different forms, and that it may be actively misleading. So then it's really a question of translation, and in this sense, it is a sort of translation, but one that got baked into the whole writing system itself.
Great, thank you, Marc.